So welcome back to another episode of Integrative Wellness Radio. So this month we're really diving into a topic that unfortunately is affecting so many different people, and it's really elaborating a little bit further on pain. And we wanted to talk about this because we do find that when people are dealing with what they assume to be physical pain that is affecting their activities of daily living, that it's super linear. It's going to be, well, I had an old injury, or I slept wrong, I have a bad pillow, my mattress is too soft, or whatever the case may be. And we find that the way that we look at pain is just very, very one-dimensional. And we want to elaborate further, and we're going to do a part 1 and part 2, because when it comes to pain, there's everything from pain that can stem from stress and emotional things that we're dealing with or holding on to. But then there's this other avenue of different types of stressors when it comes to infections, lymph nodes, more immune system problems that can also really affect our pain patterns. And then there's also a neurological component there. So in part 1, we really want to focus a little bit more on the way that we deal with stress and how that can actually physically manifest. And Dr. Nick is definitely going to dive more into some of the really amazing things that he sees utilizing his method called the DiMartini method. Or I shouldn't say his method, but it's DiMartini is the one who created it, but it's something that he uses as a tool in our practice. And it's very, very fascinating when you're able to see the different things that people are either dealing with or holding on to, and how it can actually manifest physically.
100%. And I always say it's like our biggest disservice that surrounds pain is our relationship with it. And it's our relationship, because it's not anybody's fault, but we've been taught, like you said, very linear relationship with pain. It's like, if you have a knee pain, it's a knee problem. If you have a headache, it's a problem in the head, which is honestly sometimes true, and most of the times not, when it comes to actually the physical causation of it.
I think that's also why we do what we do now, because for those of you that know us from the beginning of our practice, which is almost 9 years ago now, which is crazy to say, but we started out as doing chiropractic nutrition supplementation, and we felt that that was being, integrative. But I know that
Wrong.
yes. But I know for me, I was very frustrated because people were coming in saying, fix my knee. And, based off of my clinical experience as well as my education, I knew that it wasn't always just the knee. But still, looking at the body from a physical standpoint, as chiropractors, we were saying, okay, well, your knee can be caused from your ankle or your foot or your hip, etc. And then we learned more and more and more, and we truly started to move our practice into an integrative medicine layout. And we did that because then we started to realize that these different pains can be associated with infections. They could be associated with vascular issues. They could be associated with different emotional things. And I'm excited for you to kind of go into that, because when we were talking just to even prepare for this, one of the things you said is how, when somebody's scared to take that next step in their life, they can sometimes manifest pain in their lower extremities. So that could be a knee, it could be an ankle. So I want you to take the show on that and be able to talk a little bit more about some of these patterns and some of these emotional ties to it, because it's literally just so fascinating with some of the things that we've seen, throughout the duration of our clinical practice.
Yeah, and like anything, stop me if I get too deep.
The king of getting deep.
It's one of my favorite things to do in life. But encompassing big picture, what I've kind of put together so far is that most physical problems don't have a physical cause. It's either biochemical, it's emotional, it's mental. It's something that's really not a physical problem that's finally ending up stressing the physical body out, and then we experience pain, so we have our linear programming, and we think it's a physical problem. On the opposite of that, I also see very similar things, is that a lot of, whether it's depression, anxiety, anger, a lot of our emotional perception issues aren't really a mental problem. It's more of the same thing. It's more of a chemical, it's more of a physical. It's all those other stresses that finally the mind can't deal with it anymore, and then boom, now we're very unstable, I guess you could call it, emotionally. So,
Well, and I think one thing that you say a lot that really just resonates with me is that when we are dealing with a emotion, if that is depression especially, it's a polarized view. And you say that primarily because usually there's balance in the scenario, the situation, the bad relationship. But because of somewhat how our minds are programmed, but also how we've been programmed in society, is we usually only see the bad.
mm-hmm.
And it's very difficult, especially when you're in that stress state, to ever see the other side of how the person, the relationship, or the situation can actually be benefiting you in some degree.
100%.
And that polarized view makes us feel unlucky, or makes us feel depressed, or makes us feel angry. And that's always a really fascinating thing that I feel like I personally use as a tool, is when I am feeling that negative emotion, I always sit back and say, okay, what's the other side of this that I'm not seeing?
Mm-hmm.
Or what's the potential lesson that I need to learn from the situation as well?
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, you're opening a rabbit hole for me to dive deep down with that. I want to go, just a little bit.
Okay, we'll come back to it.
I want to go just a little bit into it, because
Mhm.
it could, I guess, pre-frame some of the stuff we're going to go into, talk about how emotions can be held in physical tissue. But it's like, it is the concept of thinking that, we are polarized. And polarization, not to get too deep in like the physics, but everything has energy, and it has a positive, like a battery has a positive side and a negative side.
Mhm.
And every single cell has a polarity, a positive and a negative. The Earth has a North Pole and a South Pole. Literally everything has, made up of energy, has
Mhm.
that. And understanding that really all energy is balanced. You can't have a negative polarity without having a positive polarity. It's impossible to have both.
Well, I think that's the really cool
Impossible to only have
thing,
one.
is that this is not our opinion. Like the seeing the positive and the negative in a situation, like, it's physics. Like, it's literally the way that there's always balance. So
Yeah.
I think that's the really cool thing about it.
Yeah, so it's like when you said, like, sometimes there's a good side. No, it's always there's a good side.
Yeah.
It's just that sometimes we see it, sometimes we don't.
Most of the time we don't.
Most of the time we don't. And it's not our fault. It's because our animalistic nature, as we've evolved through time, it's like seeing the negative has kept us alive. So
Mhm.
it's a very important.
It's a survival mechanism.
Yeah, it's very important to not judge yourself, because that's how we're programmed. But now most of those programmings aren't necessary. So we actually need to install a different program mentally for our systems to run, because we're running on an outdated program. And that new program is really it's installed via exercise. So it's like you become a marathon runner by starting out running a mile here, a mile there, increasing it, and then finally you get to a point where you can run a marathon.
Unless you're from New Jersey and you just do it. It's true.
I'll keep those comments to another podcast. And now I lost where I was at. But the other side, I don't even know what the hell I was talking about.
All right, before you get too deep, why don't you start giving us some of those examples of
Oh, no.
Okay.
So, because this is necessary, because it's like you don't just get to seeing the other side. You have to train yourself to it. And it's an exercise to be able to increase that awareness. And as you do this routinely and look for, if we have an example where we're noticing this negativity, and then we're training ourselves to see the balance of it, that balance and that awareness increases over time. So we become more self-aware, more conscious, and we're not holding as much stress into our subconscious mind.
Yeah.
So it's becoming more balanced. But until we do that, a lot of that stress gets stored in our physical body because we're all busy. We have to go to the next part of our life, the next chapter. We got to take the kids here. We got to do something with the dogs. We got a job. We got to make food. We got tons of responsibilities throughout life. So if we don't deal with it, it's not like it goes away. It's energy. Energy is not created or destroyed. It's just transferred. Yeah. So it's transferred to someplace, a storage bank, whether that's a knee, whether that's a hip, whether that's a low back, whether that's a neck, a shoulder. That imbalanced stress gets stored. And
I just want to like make this disclaimer because for people that are just like, is this really real? Like, is this even possible? So I think just such a simple example that I hear very often is how many people, when they get stressed, say, oh, my stomach really, starts to bother me, or I start to notice that I have, more loose bowel movements when I get stressed, or, all my stress, I really just, feel right here in my gut. So
before every single football game growing up, I would always have diarrhea because I was just so stressed out. Sorry, too much information.
Oh, that's all right. But I think that that's a really relatable thing for people. But obviously their stomach is not hurting all the time. It's really just when they're at that peak for stress.
Right.
So, when it comes to these other manifestations that are probably not on people's radar at all, that's what we want to talk about.
Probably, there's tons of stories, but probably my favorite one was the carpal tunnel syndrome. And like as chiropractors, carpal tunnel, we have pretty much like a sheath, like almost like you could think of like a tendon that wraps around your wrist, and depending on like poor typing form or whatever you're doing throughout the day, it can impinge on a nerve that creates really bad pain and symptoms, lack of strength within the hand. And chiropractors know that honestly a lot of the problems here actually starts in the elbow. But when you look at the emotions behind it, it's all like, you're holding on to something so tight that you're not allowing yourself to let go of. And understanding that, I had a newer patient come in, and her main complaint was carpal tunnel syndrome. She actually had carpal tunnel surgery, where they cut the sheath and allow everything to open up so it's not impinging on the median nerve, and nothing worked for her. And she still had a lot of scar tissue, not only from the surgery, but inflammation and everything that the cause wasn't dealt with. And it was literally the first appointment, and I tend not to get too deep usually on emotions because people, especially if they're there for more of a physical problem, and we haven't really stepped into helping them understand that there's more possibilities. But she was from Jersey, and she's like, just get me better as quick as possible. I don't care what it is. So I just went right for it. And I was like working on her a little bit and kind of doing some trigger point spots, but more of like a distraction as we were talking to her. And I was like, a lot of times this can just come up from holding on to something in your life. And I don't know if anything comes to mind. And literally before I could even like take my eyes off of working on her forearm and up to her eyes, she was crying. And she had a family member that had just passed, and she was holding on to a lot of that emotions, quote unquote, being strong for the family. And I helped her see, kind of gave her just a quick, quote unquote, mini DiMartini, understanding that all energy is balanced, and that honestly the DiMartini method, one of the best things about it is for grief. I don't know how many thousands and thousands of grief cases that just DiMartini himself alone has helped, but all the facilitators underneath him. Because when you understand grief, we're grieving not the loss of the person, we're grieving the loss of the traits that they were giving us.
Yes.
Whether they were giving us support or love, like if they were giving us protection. That's what we grieve. We don't grieve the loss of the actual physical human being, but when you understand that energy is not created or destroyed, it's just transferred. So a trait being energy, that trait was just transferred. It was transferred over to another friend, another family member, possibly even a pet sometimes, and helping her see that just quick awareness that what she thought was lost really wasn't there, and she had everything that she thought was lost. Literally, I could feel as I'm working on her forearm, everything just melted away. And I didn't even do any adjustments like on her ulnar or radius. Didn't even like, just did a little bit of muscle work. And by the time we got done, it was just a quick 20-minute session. She goes, besides honestly not having any pain in my hand, I feel like I just lost 20 pounds. And I was like, so can I charge you your whole program for today? Or is that just one visit? But yeah, I mean, we continued, because that's also the other side of it. It's like, once you remove the cause and there is tissue damage, yeah, you need to go in and physically help heal the tissue. But if you're working on the effect, you're always going to be working on the effect constantly until you actually resolve the cause.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that was probably one of my favorite stories, but I mean, same thing for like plantar fasciitis, when the fascia on the feet get really tight. That's like a big part of like, you're not stable, you're not grounded, your foundation's not solid at all. So it's trying to become tight as possible to compensate for the looseness. Same thing with like knees and hips, like not stepping forward into that next chapter of your life. Like, why are you holding back? Where's the resistance? And understand the resistance, a lot of that comes from fear. So you're just figuring out where that fear is and then breaking down the fear and seeing how it benefits you and it's a drawback, and how going through all the balances so that you can resolve the cause. And then, yeah, the hip might be rotated, you know, the muscles might not be firing, the tibia, the knee could be rotated, the actual patella, the kneecap might not be tracking properly. Then that's the time to really work on that, and you're going to get awesome effects, but it's also going to heal a lot quicker, because you're not having that cause, that stress that's like fighting each other. And that's like, you know, it's interesting always talking to other chiropractors, because sometimes they give a shit because they're like, oh, you're not a chiropractor anymore, you're like blah blah blah. And I'm just like, and there's like, if you all you want to do is practice structural work, like that's fine, but what I found, it just takes a little longer when you're only focusing on one system. So it's like, either you work with a team if you don't want to do those other things, like 100% just stay in your zone of excellence. Like, don't do something that you're not good at or that you're not passionate about, but at least increase your awareness so you can understand that there's more to the story. And I think that's what drives us, is that having the blinders on and not actually acknowledging that there's so many different systems, and that anything can cause stress to any other part of the body and any other system. Is what really the cause of pain comes from.
Well, I think that's probably what excites me every day about being, you know, an integrative practitioner, is that I get to piece the puzzle together for people and have them truly understand, you know, why they potentially haven't gotten better at this point, what has been missing, like what has been the root cause all along, and also what is the more personalized approach for them. Because every single person's needs are very, very different, but it requires you to ask the right questions and to dig a little bit deeper and to maybe ask those uncomfortable questions. You know, we understand that talking about emotional layers is not very comfortable for people. I know that that was a part of my life that I didn't want to acknowledge for a really long time. And I was focusing on my body from a very physical and chemical standpoint. So I was constantly, you know, making dietary tweaks and eliminating things out of my diet and taking a boatload of supplements and, you know, getting, you know, chiropractic and more physical work. And then when I kept hitting my plateaus was when I had to realize there was another layer here that maybe I wasn't thinking about on a day-to-day. I wasn't sitting there thinking about, you know, my past or different resentments that I was still holding, but they were still in there and they were unresolved. And it was definitely a huge part of why I kept hitting my plateaus. So, you know, for those of you listening, it's not that this is 100% the root to your pain, but it's something to consider. You know, some people are just very honest with themselves and like, yeah, I'm super stressed. And yeah, I still hate my dad. Or yeah, I still have a best friend that when we were 8 years old that, you know, I still think she's a jerk for what she did to me. You know, these are like, sound so silly, but these are things that can stick with us in the long term. And that can really affect us. And, you know, who doesn't have some level of fear? Who doesn't fear something? And I know that we've had so many hurdles with fear, as business owners and as entrepreneurs, and also as being integrative physicians, because what we do is not common practice and it is different. It is outside the box. And, having different things that came up in our physical bodies that, were us hitting the glass ceiling because of our fear. And it's just so fascinating when you're able to have the awareness. And I think that's like the most important thing is when you're dealing with this, and if you're really resonating with what we're saying, this is not about, you having to go into therapy and you have to do all of these things to resolve your emotional issues and it's going to take forever. It's just